What's your name?
Sean Stewart.
Sean Stewart, and you're from?
I was born in the States, but I've lived in about 7 different countries.
Okay.
Most recently Germany.
Okay, you were in Russia for 11 years.
I was in Russia for 11 years. I was in Britain for almost the same time. A couple of years in Japan, 6 months in Italy, States, Germany, unless I'm forgetting something. Yeah.
And you're a historian.
That's right. For me, I have 2 master's degrees in history, so I guess that's...
it's a qualification, yeah. Okay, so how would Germans identify themselves? As happy, stoic, serious? Because I met a Slavic girl on the train, and she was saying that she felt that Germans were more serious.
Well, there's a long answer to that, and there's a slightly shorter answer. The truest answer is that there is practically no such thing as a German. So up until the 1870s, German was just a geographical expression. So it's like saying today Scandinavia, or saying Iberia. What do the Iberians believe? You know what I mean? So if you're talking about Scandinavia, it's 4 countries, it's different regions as well. So the Germans have a history of sort of independence. So, you know, of decentralization and of strong regional identities. Even in the First World War, for example, the Bavarians, people from Munich and so on, they fought in their own army. It was within the German army, but they had their own uniforms and their own commanders and everything. So you've got a history of a country which it has a reputation, because thanks to Hitler, I suppose, of being very centralized and, you know, everybody's marching to the same drum. In reality, it's very fragmented and very decentralized. So how Germans look at themselves depends on which German you ask, how well traveled they are, how educated they are. But in principle, we can say 2 contradictory things. The first thing is that they have the reputation of being humorless and being serious and stoic and following orders, and they know they have that reputation, and they joke about it among themselves. Right. So only in Germany could you find a sentence like, we take humor very seriously. Humor is no laughing matter, right? You have to do it properly, right?
Yeah.
But historically, Germans have had exactly the opposite view of themselves. So German culture, to the extent that a generic German culture exists, it exists as a pushback against French culture. And French culture had dominated in Europe and in Central Europe. For example, Frederick II, who was king here in the mid-18th century, he spoke French as his preferred language. He said German is a language like Voltaire said, German is a language you speak only to your horses and to soldiers.
I thought it was to dogs.
Dogs or horses. I think it was horses. But in any case, one or the other. Something that Frederick agreed with entirely. He boasted about never having read a book in German. All his German history books are in French. Then you've got Napoleon, you've got the French Revolution coming in. So what you saw happening was a process where German intellectuals, the movers and shakers and so on, started to ask themselves, well, what makes us German? And if the French did, in sort of intellectual discussion, rationalism, doing things predictably and so on, there's certain ways you wrote an opera, certain ways you did a play, then the Germans were the opposite. They were passionate. They were the people who had a deep, primeval, beyond logic connection to the soil, right, to the land. So you could find German culture in the forest clearing, in the cottage, and it was all about passion, Sturm und Drang, the sorrows of young Werther, right, this story by Goethe, which had the central character commit suicide because he lost the love of his life, and it encouraged a spate of suicides in the beginning of the 1800s. People just were killing themselves in admiration of this character. Beethoven was a product of this German love of passion and irrationality. And he once said to some prince, he said, look, there's hundreds of princes like you. You're just who you are because of who you were, of the family you were born into. But there's only one me, and I got to where I am through work. Being special. And so this passion, this idea that the music of Beethoven and the poetry of Schiller and all this, it could never have been written by a Frenchman of that period. So the Germans have this contradictory image where they're rule followers and stoic, humorless people. At the same time, they're full of drama and Ride of the Valkyries and this Wagnerian passion and individualism and the triumph of the will. And that's something that Hitler fed off of with his propaganda statement, the film that he made with Leni Riefenstahl, this triumph of the will. That's reflecting this strain of German thought that you succeeding off your own back and into your own work and this sort of individualism. So that's sort of the German character in a very small nutshell. So it depends on who you ask and how you ask it, which strain they'll tap into.
Okay. Okay, do you feel that culture and traditions have changed in any way in the last 10 years in Germany?
Many things have stayed the same. You can read traveler stories from the 19th century and find things that are the same. So a lot of fundamental things are the same. You find, there's like the new generation with the growth of technology and mass migration and immigration. You get people who are, welcoming immigrants, for example, and like with England as well, the same thing in Great Britain. The Indian curries are the national dish. Kebabs are the national dish here in Berlin, for example. More than traditional. So is that changing? Well, I would say probably more has stayed the same. More deeper things have stayed the same than superficial things have changed. But that's just very subjective.
So the traditional German culture with the braids and all that, is it slowly dissipating? Because what I get concerned about is the Western culture influencing these different countries, and then we're slowly seeing those traditional things disappear.
It's evolving. So you could still find these traditional things in the villages. Sometimes they're consciously put on, they're consciously keeping the heritage alive. The people go around, blonde girls go around with their hair done, not in Berlin, but then again, it never has been a city for that sort of thing. That's more of a southern and western thing anyway. I wouldn't say anything shocking has occurred, where you would say that there's like a marked change. Like in the last 10 years, we can't recognize the place anymore.
So what would you suggest to tourists that come here, either to move here or visiting here, what would you suggest to them to do to help preserve the German identity and culture?
Despite the Hitler years and the image of the heel-clicking Nazi and you must follow orders, fundamentally Germans are individualists, right? And they love lack of centralization. Right? They like local stuff, their own local flavor, their own town, their own individual personality.
So they're very supportive of mom and pop shops.
They are, that sort of Mittelstand, as they call it. So you have here a lot of small family businesses that employ maybe 10, 20 people, and that's the heart of the economy. That's keeping the country going, and that's been that way for centuries. Even before there was a country. In some ways you could say that Germany is a country that dates from 1990. So it's not that old. So when we say Germany, you are talking about a sort of a linguistic zone like Scandinavia. Pizza, right?
Okay, so what are some festivals that you think are worthwhile for people to visit?
Living in Berlin, they tend to have... Berlin's in some ways very modern. It's a city of immigrants, and it always has been. It's not a classically German city in that regard. So you don't find much folksy stuff here. You find the same kind of stuff you'd find in New York or London. So we just had the marathon go through yesterday. In a nutshell, I could say if you want to be properly German, don't go to Oktoberfest.
Don't go to Oktoberfest.
That's like the tourist. That's like Checkpoint Charlie's, right? So everybody's going there, and they don't really know what it was. It's not that old of a festival anyway. It's sort of a 19th century creation. And it's fun. Go there as a party. If you want to go and drink and do crazy stuff, I don't want to suggest like you don't go. But don't go thinking you're doing some deeply Germanic fundamental thing. It's ballooned into a thing which is no longer connected to what it used to be in the 19th century.
Are there any small towns that are not well known that you would suggest people visit?
The small towns are where you're going to find the best of Germany, in my opinion, because the cities are mostly bombed during the war. So a lot of the cities are rebuilt, reconstructed. People like Rick Steves will recommend you going to Rothenburg, for example.
Rothenburg?
Rothenburg, yeah, Rothenburg.
Rothenburg.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Rothenburg. Okay.
Yeah, on the Tauber. It's nice. I've been there. It's very nice. It's lovely. It is touristy. It's not Checkpoint Charlie. It is authentic. But you can find any number of places in Germany just by hiring a car and going down the B roads, and you'll stumble through these villages that are very nice. You could visit a town called Brandenburg. So we're in Brandenburg. Berlin was the capital of Brandenburg, Prussia, and then it became Prussia. That's a long story. So the town of Brandenburg is about an hour away from here, a little bit less, 15 minutes by train. to the west, and there you'll find a very nicely preserved town, buildings from across a range of centuries. It was the capital before Berlin was in this region.
Oh, okay.
So that's why the Brandenburg Gate is named after that town, so it's just the gate that leads to Brandenburg eventually. So before the 1400s, that was where the dukes sat, that was their center of power. So it's been sort of off the map a little bit since then. But that's good for us travelers, because you can really see a slice of the real place. If you're interested in military history, you can go to a place called Zossen, Zossen. There you have the command bunkers from the German army in the Second War, where Operation Barbarossa was run from, this kind of thing. You need a tour to go there, but if you're a war buff, that's really a can't miss place. Sachsenhausen concentration camp, of course everybody knows about that, is quite popular now. It's ballooned in the last 2 years or so in popularity.
So we already kind of talked about Checkpoint Charlie being the Kim Kardashian of
in my
tourists.
opinion, it's
So what are some other tourist traps here that you would suggest avoiding?
In the full sense of the question, that's the only one that comes to mind. There are places where you find a lot of tourists, like the Brandenburg Gate. Everybody and his uncle is there, photographing themselves in front of it and so on. But it's worth seeing. It's an iconic part of the city, so it's famous for a reason.
Yeah.
Even though you won't find many Germans hanging out there.
Okay.
It's like a national sport. The only one who can beat them are the British.
In complaining.
Yeah. It's not necessarily vile complaining. It's not like nasty complaining. It's just just whinging, basically. So it's hard to say. So I wouldn't venture in a publishable opinion about that. Off the record, I would say it's good. I know they get a lot of Third Reich thrown at them when they're kids, and civic responsibility is emphasized. You've got a quite high voter turnout compared to the States, for example. Even in small-scale elections, like locals, just for the council or something, people turn out to vote. And I've been told that's because of the education, but the idea is that they want people to be educated, because educated people will make informed voting decisions and so on and so on. So it's different from the States, where the States has become prohibitively. It's a pure for-profit thing in the States. Here it's not. It's more. I wouldn't necessarily publish this, but I would say it's viewed more as a human right here than as a privilege of the wealthy or those with access to credit, like it is in the States. But again, that's entirely subjective.
So what about what are some common stereotypes? Stereotypes against...
from Germans to other people.
Uh-huh.
My feeling, and again, it's very subjective, is that here, particularly in Berlin, people are much more open-minded to difference than they are in almost any place in Canada or the States, with the exception of New York or LA or something like that. So you find more people willing to tolerate differences and celebrate differences, to accept others, to put a premium on human rights and so on. Not everybody's, there's people, fringe lunatics in every society, but you find a little bit less of it here that I can see. So that's a big proviso that I can see. So what people actually talk about when they're, talking in rapid German and using idioms that I can't understand, at the next day they could be cursing out, Muslims to the nth degree, and I'll say, oh, isn't it a lovely day? This kind of thing. There's stuff I might not be catching. But my perception is that they're markedly more open here. Now, in the countryside, it's not the case. The countryside is more, particularly in this part of Germany, in the northeast part of Germany, there's a backlash against immigration. There's a pushback against multiculturalism. They think it's failed. They think integration doesn't work. And this has to do, like it always does, with lack of money and lack of jobs, lack of opportunity. So blame the foreigners, blame the policies that brings them in. So if you...
It seems like it's that way throughout history, because even in, the time of Jesus in Jerusalem, the further out from the city, the more conservative you would get.
Yeah, and that's for good reason, because the life was dangerous and precarious. So you have to do what works. You can't just experiment and see, let's see what happens, because that could result in the death of your whole family. Right?
Yeah.
So sailors and farmers are famously conservative, right? Because they have to be. But you do find that in the towns and the cities, the towns versus the cities here, and everywhere. It's the same in Russia, for example. Honestly speaking.
Okay, so what is the major political conversations that are going on right now in Germany?
Exactly that. So immigration, integration, tolerance, I suppose, the limits of tolerance. Funnily enough, I would say, with the election results from yesterday, the alternative for Deutschland party, the right-wing party, got 13% of the votes, which makes it
13%.
Yeah.
Wow.
And some of those, funnily enough, from immigrants.
Really?
Yeah. So the Russian-speaking immigrants here are voting against immigration. And this comes down in many cases just to blind racism. So they've got their bits and they don't want anyone else to have access to it anymore. Right?
Sounds like they need to go take a walk through that art.
Oh, they'll say it's propaganda.
Oh, geez.
And a lot of them, well, this is what you'll find a lot of them doing that. Like, not only them, I mean, immigrants from across the world will come here and say, oh, it's propaganda. It's,
what was that 3D art piece, the integrative art piece called again?
Which one?
The one that looks like the Jewish graves.
Oh, the Holocaust Museum, the Holocaust Memorial, the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, to give it its full name.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So I would say these are the hot topics. And as usual with any society, the hot topics are finance, so how's the economy doing? The other big topic apart from immigration is to what extent is it justified that the German economy should prop up all the other European Union economies. And by that they mean not the French or the Dutch so much, but they mean the Eastern Europeans and the Southeast Europeans and the Mediterranean countries. So, like for example, Greece, constantly bailing out Greece, constantly bailing out the south of Spain. So the Greeks will respond and say that Merkel is Hitler, and this is just another way of Germans trying to extend their domination throughout Europe. The Germans say, we're funding you because you're too lazy and incompetent to work, so why should we spend our money on you, you know. So this is the conversation, right? And they're corrupt. They're corrupt as well. And they know they're corrupt. I mean, they're blatantly and I mean, not
Greece
all of them.
knows they're corrupt.
Yes, of course they do. They got into their own problem. They, you know, and I can't say this, you know, too much of a historian to fence all of my statements with, you know, limiting sentences, limiting words, but I mean, they know they're corrupt because they submitted fake documents. They doctored the documents to when they applied to join the Eurozone, saying, oh, you know, we're debt-free, our economy's good and nothing to see here, keep moving, you know. And
Wow.
the people like each other. I mean, you got a lot of Germans going to Greece. They love it. You got Greeks working here. There's Greek restaurants. I mean, you know, it's not that the people dislike each other. It's that you got the fringe, where you got the people who are unemployed in old East Germany, who are sitting in the villages, and they see people wearing burqas on the streets, and they think, okay, look, I've not got any money. So what is my, you know, what exactly are we doing? We're paying for these people to come in to build mosques. We're paying to prop up the lazy Greeks because they can't be organized, they can't sort themselves out. So, and then the other side who says, you know, tolerance and openness, inclusion. A lot of this acceptance of immigrants is a sort of, I think, a guilt complex from the Second War. So they murdered a lot of people in the 40s, and now they're trying to make up, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are making up for it by being extra inclusive. Right? And it's a spontaneous thing.
That makes sense.
It's a rebound in the other direction. Right? And so you get societies like the Poles, for example, who there's a strong conservative streak in the Poles for very long historic reasons. We can go on for hours about that. But you see a lot of immigrants don't go to Poland or to Russia or Ukraine because they know they'll get their heads kicked in. Right? They'll come here where they know they're welcome. And the Germans, having this history of, you know, unsavory conduct in the 1940s, to put it mildly, feel guilty. They say, okay, come to us.
Yeah, I'm surprised that they're still accepting immigrants.
It's slowed down. They've made it more difficult now. The peak has passed, but still, the idea is, again, now that you've got these people here, now they're going to invite their grandparents and their children and their, you know, their 10 cousins, and you know,
It's essentially going to change the way German culture is.
it's hard to say. This is a topic I've studied historically. The real question, this is a burning question in historical studies, not for anybody else, but for historians, this is a burning topic, is how did the British Isles go from being occupied by the Romans for 400 years, or 300 years, so they're speaking Latin. The language there was a P Celtic, so let's call it Welsh, right? And then the Anglo-Saxons came, and suddenly, now the number of loan words in Welsh of Latin is very small. Fenster, for example, meaning window, they took in very like a dozen words entered Welsh in 300 years. How is it in the subsequent 300 years, the Anglo-Saxons, who archaeology has a hard time identifying in large numbers, they came over in small numbers to Britain, post-Roman Britain. How did they turn that into England, where you've got an English language, but Welsh was pushed back to the fringe, right? And you've got an English culture, an English language in that island. How did that happen? So the old theory was that they invaded in large numbers. Like you got thousands and thousands of Anglo-Saxons coming in, committing genocide, murdering the Anglo-Romans, the British Romans. Let's call it the Welsh, even though it's not correct. But now there's no archaeological evidence for that.
Where did it all go?
Right. So now the connection between that historical mystery and today is this: how many newcomers do you have to have that number? What's the critical mass?
Okay.
So do you need millions and millions and millions of Syrians, for example, or Pakistanis to overrun the place, right? Or do you need just a few? And what accounts for the change? Because the British example would suggest you just need a few, right?
Yeah.
Because there's no evidence for mass migration into Britain in the 5th century and 6th century. So, for example, if I know this is going off topic, so you can stop recording or delete this if you want. But for example, if an archaeologist excavated Russia, the ruins of Moscow, it's 2,000 years from now, you would find Soviet, and then immediately you'd find Coca-Cola, Pepsi, coffee shops, and so on. So what can you conclude from that archaeological evidence? The temptation is to conclude that Coca-Cola drinkers invaded and defeated vodka drinkers. Nothing of the sort happened. What happened is the same people stayed there. They just adopted the culture they found more attractive. So they themselves just started drinking Coca-Cola. And that's why you see it in the archaeological record, right? So there was something about the English culture that was attractive to the British, the Welsh, and they basically adopted the language and the culture. That's another theory. The problem with that is that the Romano-Welsh, the Romano-British, had a higher culture than the Anglo-Saxons did. You see the similarities now?
Yeah.
Higher level of culture, higher level of material culture. So why in the world would these people have adopted a culture which was less sophisticated than theirs? So there's no evidence for mass murder and military occupation. It's inexplicable why a culture that had bathhouses and lived in mansions and so on would suddenly adopt the language and customs of a few traders and a few immigrants coming into Britain in the 6th century, in the 5th century. So how did they start speaking English? Where did the English language come from? It's a mystery. And I think that's my opinion, is that that's relevant today to this immigration question.
Yeah.
Because you're finding similar things here. You find, what did I just say before? I said Germans, yes, they eat their sausage, but you find any number of Germans crowding the kebab shops, right? They study Middle Eastern languages. They find Islam interesting. So they're all hanging out in Kreuzberg. I mean, I was there recently. You can just watch them. So I'm not saying it's good or bad. I think it's nice. I think culture changes all the time. Culture is always evolving.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting to watch this process, to see where the critical mass is.
I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah. Because
at what point do you tip the scale and lose a culture completely?
Or not lose it, it just develops into a new thing.
I guess I'm more thinking about the Indian culture and
Right.
how we're slowly seeing that.
So that's an extreme case.
Yeah.
If you're talking about Native Americans or
Yeah.
Indians.
Native Americans.
Yeah, so that's a case of outright genocide and cultural genocide at the very least, right? And overwhelming numbers. But I mean, again, there you had a lot of Native Americans, tribes working with the white men.
Yeah.
Against other Native Americans.
They would go out and kill each other.
Yeah, and it wasn't a case of here's the white man and here's the brown man and they clashed and one wiped out the other. It was a much more complex process of assimilation and working together and co-opting and bribing and having them fight against each other as much as against the white man and so on. So it's not a straightforward picture, right? And now here in Europe you're seeing it. So in France, for example, so France now has this very strong, very in some ways cohesive, in some ways not cohesive, my Algerian minority. From the time when Algeria and Morocco and so on were part of the French Empire. So they live in these banlieues, these sort of neighborhoods around Paris. And if you take the train from Charles de Gaulle into Paris, you go and take the so-called Aero Express, whatever it's called. First of all, it's not an express; it takes forever. And secondly, it makes stops in these neighborhoods. And you'd look out the window, you think you're going through the Bronx in the 1970s. It's like you feel like it's dangerous. You know, it's like characters out there that you wouldn't want to meet in daylight, never mind at night. And none of them are French in the sense of being white European. They're all, you know, sons of immigrants from Algeria. So the problem is they're not assimilated. So the French look down on them as foreigners, basically, even though they were born in France and have never been to Algeria. The Algerians look at them as Frenchmen because they speak French and live in the European Union, and what are you complaining about? Right? We have to live here. And so they're at home nowhere. You see?